Today I wanted to talk about one of EM Forster's greatest novels, A Passage to India. This was the first EM Forster novel that I ever read, and I loved it at the time, and in doing my rereads of Forster's works, I finally came to it. It's his last book, except for Morris, of course, and it's the last one that he wrote, which is quite surprising given that this book was published, I think, in the 20s, and Forster didn't live until the 70s, and so it's amazing that in all that time he didn't write another book. And it's a real shame, although, having said that, all of his books are wonderful, so it certainly left us wanting more. Part 1, Summary. A Passage to India is set during the time of the British Raj, with the backdrop of the Indian independence movement as well, in the 1920s. It mostly focuses on the personal lives of 4 characters and how they interact. We have the Indian doctor, Aziz, and his friend, Cyril Fielding, and we have Mrs. Moore, an elderly woman, mother to Ronnie, who has been in India for a while and is quite jaded, and Ronnie's fiancée, Adela, who is travelling with Mrs. Moore to come to India to secure her marriage to Ronnie. But it's really the 4 characters, excluding Ronnie, that are the main players in the story. At the start of the story, Adela and Mrs. Moore become friendly with Aziz, and he offers to take them on a trip to the famous Marabar caves, which are actually fictionalised in the story. While there, Adela has a strange experience in the caves and believes that someone attacked her, and she blames Dr. Aziz, which results in a huge dramatic court case, which sets all of the political tensions that have been building up between India and Britain throughout the novel aflame. And things get pretty bad from there, especially with our 4 main protagonists, as we see their friendships and relationships collapsing and changing in consequence of this situation. Part 2, Magical Atmosphere. In my reader's blog, I talked a little bit about Passage to India already, and one thing that I mentioned there and that I wanted to elaborate on is the magical atmosphere that we find in A Passage to India, and in fact most of Forster's works, but I think he really crystallises this atmosphere in this novel, which is amazing given that he's now writing about a place that he doesn't know as well. There's a few passages in the story, but the one that I want to focus on comes in very early in the story, when Mrs. Moore finds herself going to a mosque on her own, which is a strange thing for a woman, especially an elderly woman, to be doing, especially an elderly white woman, and she gets caught there by Aziz, who is immediately hostile to her because he thinks that she's being disrespectful, that she hasn't taken off her shoes, but when he realises that she has, they strike up a kind of friendship, and we get this wonderful scene between them that's just very heartwarming. Not much is said, but it doesn't really need to be said. They just have this immediate bond. And then we have the mosque at night, and the whole atmosphere of this is beautiful. In fact, it's probably some of the best writing that I've ever come across. Forster's writing is so powerful in this passage that it even has an effect on the characters themselves. Mrs. Moore and Dr. Aziz strike an unlikely friendship that lasts the course of the novel, despite the fact, and we'll talk more about this later, that Mrs. Moore has a somewhat ambiguous relationship to Dr. Aziz, and perhaps isn't as friendly with him as he thinks, at least in terms of how she acts. Part 3, Adela Gets Quested. Of all of the characters, I think that Adela acts as the surrogate for the reader, because everyone else has been in India for a while, and so they're enmeshed in the political situation and the social context, whereas Adela is arriving for the first time, and she's somewhat idealistic about India, claiming that she even wants to see the real India, as opposed to whatever it is that she's been reading in stories and the news. And this is arguably what the typical Forster reader might have felt at the time, especially if they hadn't been to India before. And so through Adela, the reader is led down this path where they have these expectations, and ultimately they are thwarted in the course of the novel. Adela herself gets quite the reality check in the course of the story, and I think that that's why she gets the name that she gets, Adela Quested, as if she's sort of being quested. Rather than going on a quest, her quest gets her and changes her into someone who is ultimately a better, more sensitive, more humane person. Not to say that she's evil or bad at the beginning, she's just a bit naive and a bit idealistic is all. Adela is definitely someone who would buy into, say, Orientalism, the idea that the East is somehow mystical and magical and other, and then she goes there and she realises that it's really not like that at all, and in fact a lot of the things that she finds in England repeat themselves as well in Indian culture too, suggesting that ultimately people aren't that different, even if there are still some lingering cultural differences between the two places. Adela is definitely one of my favourite, if not my favourite, Forster protagonist. I think that she's just got a little bit more depth, especially with her marriage to Ronnie. Well, not her marriage, but her engagement. I like the way that Forster really takes his time with this relationship, and it is believable. Although we don't see Ronnie as he was in England, we get these little moments where we learn that he was a much better person before he went to India and became a bit jaded. And it's nice to have those moments because the Ronnie that we get in the actual story is pretty unlikable. And we see their relationship on this sort of rocky path throughout the novel, and Forster does a fantastic job of really conveying the slow decline of their relationship, to the point where I think he's actually better at describing the declines of relationships than he is kind of motivating the positive relationships, like we see in novels like A Room with a View, or even Morris to a point. Ultimately, Adela's romance with Ronnie is just another childish dream. It was something that happened in his university days when things were brighter, and it was just immature. She needs to go to India to realise that this relationship really isn't going anywhere, and only then can she become a very mature person. Part 4. As Mrs. Moore and Aziz. So as I said in part 1, there is a strange relationship between Dr. Aziz and Mrs. Moore. It's initially this very heartwarming relationship between this elderly lady and this younger doctor, and it's wonderful, and it was one of the highlights of the book for me when I first read it. But then when we get to the court case, something changes. There's a shift in Mrs. Moore. The shift itself actually happens during the caves. She also has an experience there. There's this strange echo with the caves, and this somehow triggers or unnerves her. She becomes suddenly concerned with her mortality. She no longer wants to help people. She becomes a bit more bitter and not a very nice person. And when this is directed at people like Ronnie, it's a bit more understandable why she's like that. But when she doesn't help Aziz in his case, one can't help but feel that she's just, cutting him dry and not helping him at all and doesn't care about him. Nevertheless, there is a moment where she does sort of just brush off the idea that Dr. Aziz did touch Adela. So she clearly does believe and trust him, yet she has no desire to help. Now, one reason for this might just be that because she's an old lady, no one is going to listen to her, and so she just sees, helping as, not worth it. That being said, even if if that was me, even if I knew that it wouldn't be helpful, if my friend was in a situation like that, I would still try and help them. And this is something that doesn't affect Aziz either. He doesn't actually come to hate Mrs. Moore. His hate still gets directed towards Adela, even when Adela backtracks and says, actually, no, I don't think Aziz did that. He holds a lot of bitterness towards Adela, but not to Mrs. Moore. And this is something that Cyril actually calls him up on later in the novel. And again, Aziz just holds fast to Mrs. Moore, and it's one of the strangest parts of the novel, because by rights he really shouldn't. And it's something that really did leave a funny feeling in my mouth when I read the book, because I just didn't know what to make of Mrs. Moore after that passage. If you've read A Passage to India, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this particular point. Do you think that Mrs. Moore is ultimately all sort of, talk, and when push comes to shove, she just doesn't care about Aziz? Do you think maybe she's supposed to represent something about this sort of caring about people in an idealistic way, but then just not being willing to go the extra mile when it counts? Or do you think it is just something like she feels powerless, she recognises that her time is up and just, loses the will to care about any earthly thing? It's hard to say what Forster was going at with this, and I can't make heads or tails of it, so I'd be interested to know your thoughts down in the comments about this part of the book. Still, I can't help, like Aziz, still being drawn to that relationship, and still, those early moments in the book between those two characters are one of the highlights of the novel. Part 5, Friendship, England and India. Instead of politics, which is certainly there as a backdrop, the central crux of A Passage to India is friendship. Even the romance between Ronnie and Adela, while important, is not really the centrepiece of the book. It's there in the background, but it's pretty obvious where that's going. If you're an astute reader, or not even a very astute reader, you can see that that relationship isn't going anywhere. The key thing is friendship, and especially the friendship between Cyril and Aziz. And this becomes much more prominent once the court case kicks in and Cyril takes a stand on Aziz's side. It leads to him being ostracised by all the British people, and unfortunately though, ultimately his friendship with Aziz does suffer. It suffers when Aziz, after he is acquitted because Adela changes her mind, he decides he's going to basically, I think, sue or pursue damages from Adela to a point where she would be left destitute. And Cyril thinks that this is wrong and tries to advise against this, and Aziz starts to think that Cyril basically just has the hots for Adela and that he doesn't care about him. And he becomes almost like a jealous lover. In some of the passages, you do get that sort of vibe from Aziz, which is quite amusing. But it is purely a friendship. Nevertheless, it just comes off that way sometimes. And ultimately this does damage their friendship. The rest of the novel, which is still a long time after the court case is resolved, focuses on this friendship. And again, it's interesting that by and large, it is ultimately Aziz's pettiness that keeps this feud going. His unwillingness to trust. And while that might be politically motivated to a point, and that's hinted at in the very last lines of the novel, it's still a sign of Forster putting the personal first, recognising that human beings are primarily social creatures rather than political ones. And that's something that I really admire in fiction, recognising that you can write a political novel and that's fine, but that doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all. There are still people with their relationships and their jealousies and all of those human emotions that we have that can't just be reduced to these political explanations. I would also say that this friendship, if you want a novel that focuses on friendship, that does so in a nuanced, interesting way, and arguably is one of the best books written about friendship in my view, I would definitely recommend this one. It's not a positive outlook on friendship in the sense that things turn out all right. There's residual tensions and things. It's not a happy ending kind of story. But I just think that the way Forster captures that, and in particular thinking about the ways in which people can strike close friendships with people of a very different culture, I think is a really interesting thing. And what Forster does is that he doesn't offer any easy answers. He doesn't give an outright no, it's impossible. He doesn't give an outright yes. He doesn't vilify one side and make the other side into some kind of idealized fantasy either. It's all very complicated and messy, and that's something that Forster excels at in most of his works, but especially here with this friendship between Aziz and Cyril. Part 6, Small Differences. Forster manages to capture so much in this book. We have the breakdown of a relationship. We have the coming-of-age story of Adela. We have the stuff about Mrs. Moore and Aziz. We have the political situation at the time, and of course we have Cyril's friendship with Aziz. All of this stuff getting explored in A Passage to India. And it's actually, for Forster, it's quite a thick book, but it's not a very long novel by any stretch of the imagination either. I think it's about 350 pages, so pretty bog standard for a novel. As I said in the previous section, Forster does put the personal forward in a lot of this, but it is important to recognise that there is a political situation going on here, and in the final parts of the book, Forster does reflect a little bit on the possibility of friendship between Aziz and Cyril. And it's quite sad in these last pages, because although their friendship does get rekindled towards the end, there's the sign that this may not go on forever, and that ultimately it might sort of fizzle out. After Cyril spends a lot of time at home and he marries one of Mrs. Moore's other children, I think she's called Stella, he returns to India, and there's a moment where he reflects and thinks, would I, if I was in India now, and this whole thing with Adela happened, would I stick up for Aziz? And he's not sure that he would. Partly because maybe he's got a family, but partly because he's been in Britain again, and so those cultural influences have sort of taken a hold over him, in the sense that he now feels more loyalty to that side. Whereas before, he was enmeshed in India, and perhaps saw India as his home, and so was more protective of that side. And I think that's a really clever point that Forster gets at there. This idea that, people do change, and although what Cyril did at the time was very heroic and brave, just because he did that then, it's not obvious that he would always do that. And then we have the stuff with Aziz, who jealously believes that Cyril is with, and basically married Adela, and not telling him, and so he gets really paranoid, and then realises that he was completely wrong, and it's a bit embarrassing. And then we do have this rekindling, but there's this sort of underlying hostility under all of it. And I think Forster ends the novel with something to the effect of, until India is properly free of Britain, there could never be a true friendship between us. And that is quite sad, because you hope that they're going to reconcile fully by the end of the story, and yet this doesn't happen, because those cultural differences, those political differences in the situation do get in the way of their relationship. Part 6, Conclusion. So, Passage to India is a wonderful novel, and if you haven't read any Forster, I would definitely recommend picking this one up. Either to start with, I think it's a good start. It's very different from his other books, but because it's such a great book, it's definitely worth digging into. It deals with so much, it covers so much ground in terms of Forster's main themes. We have the focus on a heroine who's somewhat idealistic and then comes into contact with reality, but the Adela that we get here is just such a, in my view, a much better character than most of Forster's other heroines. She's a little bit more believable, a little bit more complex, and she gets put in a pretty sticky situation and then has to try and find a way to overcome it. I think the whole court case scene is wonderful, and it reminds me a little bit of To Kill a Mockingbird. If you've read that book, I think you will enjoy Passage to India. It's not really the same, and it's only because of the court case thing, but it just reminds me of that story a little bit. Of course, then we have all the other stuff going on as well. The friendship between Cyril and Aziz, Mrs. Moore and Aziz, and the strange relationship that they have with each other. And of course, and lastly, the stuff about politics and how that interacts and damages people's personal relationships. Everything is here, and it's all very interesting, and it's not a very long novel, as I said, so if you want to give it a go, I couldn't recommend it enough. Alright, that's it for my thoughts on A Passage to India. If you've read this book, do let me know what you think about it, especially on the Mrs. Moore stuff. I'm really interested in that because I have unsettled thoughts about it myself. Take care, everyone. Ta-ra!